I'm Vanessa Maria Graber, and you are listening to and watching the People Power Lunch Hour show on Philly Cam TV and WPPM 106.5 FM. And I am excited today. We have a packed show. In the first half of the program, I am going to speak with organizers of a symposium held at the University of Pennsylvania called Reparations Now. A little bit later on in the show, I will speak with folks from Reparations Now, a new organization in Philly designed to encourage voter turnout and new candidates running for office. We'll talk about all that and more on this edition of the People Power Lunch Hour. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the People Power Lunch Hour show. And on today's show, I am joined in the Philly Cam studios by Shaunee Morgan. And she is one of the organizers of a symposium called Reparations Now that was recently held at the University of Pennsylvania through their law school. And I'm also joined by Aris Merretazon. Merretazon. I was doing well before. And he is one of the panelists that was also participating in the conference. And the focus of the conference was about reparations, but also about institutions and systems of oppression and what can be done to combat those systems as we know it today. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you for having us.
So I was able to tune into some parts of the symposium. It is really, really fantastic. You assembled a great panel of people from all over the country. So thank you for doing that work.
Yeah.
I know on top of everything else you're doing in law school, it's a lot, but these conversations are really important to have. And some of the things that I wrote down here really struck me. A conversation about the movements to hold institutions, governments, and nations accountable for historical and ongoing harms. And the symposium was a call to dismantle these unjust systems of power and build a more humane society.
Yes, a lot of big words. We had big intentions. So one, thank you for having us. And as you mentioned, the recordings are online. So if folks do want to see it, they can definitely go to the Penn Law website and look up the Aris Symposium. And I think the other organizers and I were trying to make a space to talk about these historical harms that have occurred in this hemisphere, right, that have been to date unaddressed. So if we think about the transatlantic slave trade and also think about the experiences of indigenous folks in this hemisphere, those experiences have never been kind of systematically addressed in any appropriate way. And so a lot of the negative harms we see in terms of negative health outcomes, lack of socioeconomic power in these communities, those are directly connected to the kind of foundations of the nations in this hemisphere. And so we wanted to make a space to talk about that, right? Like, how can we make time and make space to address the long legacy of disenfranchisement that we see here in the US and the other countries in this hemisphere? And so, yeah, as we said, it was institutions, national governments, and kind of anyone who's had contact with these systems has a claim to answer to in terms of how we move forward.
I think that there's a misconception that reparations means everyone gets a check. Can you kind of talk about some of the other things that are included under that umbrella that go beyond just giving people money?
Yeah, and I don't think that any reparations plan has just been about giving people money. I think we first have to talk about the harm, right? And I think there is a sense of starting from the end of the story, which is what people will get, without appropriately acknowledging the harms that people face. And so for Black people in this hemisphere, it was an economic structure, right? And so people's labor was extracted without pay. And so no one today wants to work without pay. And so the idea that for hundreds of years folks were expected to work without pay is a, I think, not a misconception, but something that we need to kind of address before we start to talk about kind of what the remedies will be. That's the first point. The second point is that looking around the world, reparations look very different, and reparatory justice looks very different depending on the context, right? And so for some communities that have been harmed, reparations has been an apology from the harm doer. It's been the restoration of land. It's been a promise to discontinue the action. So it depends on the harm. And so reparatory justice asks for both parties to come to a table and have a discussion about what will reparations for this specific harm look like, right? And so before we even talk about what a reparations scheme will look like what the actual repair will be, there needs to be a discussion about the harm and then kind of what makes sense in terms of fixing it.
Can you talk about the panel that Ari was on and how he fits into this conversation?
So one of the angles that we wanted to make sure that we addressed was the ways in which institutions benefited from, participated in the transatlantic slave trade and enslavement. And there's been a lot of work done by universities in terms of looking at their own histories, right? And so if folks follow the news, they saw that recently Georgetown University kind of dug up in its history and saw that it had been saved, right? The Jesuits sold, I think, 272 enslaved black people were sold in order to save that university. And so Georgetown has begun a process of addressing that history and figuring out a way in which they can repair that harm. So we wanted a panel to look at how institutions like universities and insurance companies benefited from the slave trade, and that was the panel that Ari was on to speak to the work in which his organization has done to bring these issues to light and to figure out how we go about fixing it.
Can you talk about your organization?
I'd love to talk about it. I'm going to thank the students at the University of Penn Law for having the courage to bring forward and discuss this quote-unquote R word. And they did have a great panel. And the thing I think what demystifies, people get confused about, is the so-called time frame between the injury and today. Well, certain injuries are intergenerational. They carry over. And much like inheritance and debt, all that goes forward to the inheritor. Not only the riches, but also the debts of that family member. And so we're just saying, hey, own up to your debt owed. The record is clear, about the damage done. And my whole piece was trying to bring the University of Pennsylvania to look at its own self, because it has a deep history of enslavement, where it almost like the slave merchants morphed into the founders of the University of Pennsylvania. Wharton, Willing, Robert Morris, all these folks are all founding trustees of the university. And there just recently was a good report came out maybe 2 weeks ago about showing that University of Pennsylvania does have a predecessor history in involvement in enslavement. It was then known as the College of Philadelphia. But you change the name, but everything remains the same, you see?
Sure. And so what are some of the things that schools like Penn, Georgetown, and I went to the University of North Carolina, which again, one of these oldest institutions, what can they begin to do in order to address these issues?
I think the first thing, which Penn hasn't done yet, is acknowledge this connection. And so the report that Ari was mentioning, some students at Penn have begun to do research into the history of the original trustees, right? So Penn has maintained that it has no connection to the slave trade or enslavement, which if you think about the history of this country, the idea that an institution as old as Penn has no connection to enslavement, you think about how wealth was passed down, it's absurd, right? But the university has maintained that position. And I think the first step for institutions like Penn is to step away from that kind of defensive position of no, not us, right? So Brown came out and acknowledged, Princeton has, and so the Harvard as well, right? So all these institutions that are similarly situated as Penn have at least made that first step of we acknowledge that some of this wealth that you see here was tied to enslavement in this country. And so I think a first step is doing what the students at Penn are doing, which is documenting that history, because before you can fix anything, you have to confront it and actually acknowledge that it's there. So I think the first step is kind of institutionalizing the study of the history of these universities, right? How did you get your money? How are you where you are today? So I think what's happening at Penn is it's going to snowball into maybe something that similar to what happened at Georgetown and similar to what happens at Brown. It's this acknowledgement, and then kind of what will that look like in your internal policies? And it can look different for different schools, right? So Georgetown said, well, we have the names of these individuals and we can trace their descendants. And so what they've done is it's more of a kind of an accelerated affirmative action admissions practice for the descendants of those 272. So that's different work than what Brown has done, which is to set up a center there to study the history of Brown's involvement. So all the schools have different levels of involvement, and so their actual work will look very different, and how they fix the problems that they were involved in will look very different.
Let me also add to the key thing is disclosure, and that was essentially the topic that I had to deliver at the symposium, and it was called slavery disclosure. And usually, here in Philadelphia, in order to do business with the city of Philadelphia, you have to disclose your slavery history. And the University of Pennsylvania, as you mentioned, just don't want to do that. So there's disclosure, apology, and repair of the image, or repair of the damage done by the institution of chattel slavery.
And so you brought a book with you today.
Oh, yeah.
Ebony and
He
Ivy.
walks with this book everywhere.
Let me read a very good point that pretty much frames everything.
Sure.
Right?
Well, tell them what the book is.
Yes, the book is Ebony and Ivy, written by Craig Stephen Wilder, Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Institutions. And in the note by a reviewer, this says that the slave economy and higher education grew up together, each nurturing the other. Money from the purchase and sale of human beings built the campuses, stocked the libraries, and swelled the endowments of American colleges and universities. Slaves waited on faculty and students. Academic leaders eagerly courted the support of slaveholders and slave traders. Ultimately, as Wilder shows, our leading universities were thoroughly dependent on enslavement and became breeding grounds for the racist ideas that sustained it. In short, the American Academy never stood apart from American slavery. It stood beside church and state as the third pillar of civilization built on bondage. That's a major indictment. It's a major indictment, and the facts and circumstances of the development of this country supports it. And so why run from it? Just acknowledge it, discuss it with the people that's still injured today, and don't make any unilateral decisions about what reparations should be for the university. I mean, you have to have the descendants of those enslaved at the table to come up with the types of ways and means to repair the damage done.
Right. And so one of the other panels looked at the movement in the Caribbean to hold Britain and the former colonizing powers accountable for the slave trade. And so that movement, pretty well organized, and in terms of kind of responding to your original question of kind of what does reparations look like, the Caribbean community has put forward a 10-point plan, right? And it has the specific ask that people oftentimes say, well, what is it that you want? Like, what can reparatory justice look like? And so it ranges, right, from something as simple but hard to get as a formal apology, right? So there's not been a formal apology from the UK or from the other colonizers for enslavement. And imagine that, right? So it's something that we all kind of look at today and say, well, that's awful. We hope that to never have that happen again. But there's never been an acknowledgement or an apology of the government's involvement in that. So the first ask is that there be an apology, because apologizing means you take ownership for the thing that you've done. And so the fact that there hasn't been, and there's been kind of systematic resistance to apologizing, speaks to a sense of maybe you don't feel bad, right? Like when you refuse to apologize for something that you know you did and that everyone knows you did, it speaks to kind of a deeper sense of maybe you are not sorry. So that's the first ask, and it ranges from full apology to debt forgiveness. Nations in the Caribbean suffer from just debilitating debt because we kind of met independence with nothing. And so the only way to kind of build up a country when you have nothing is to borrow money from the IMF and from the World Bank. And so we suffer from debilitating debt. And so one of the asks is, you forgive this debt, because the reason we have this debt is you left us with nothing. You extracted from our countries and left us with nothing. So there is work being done about kind of what exactly does a reparations plan look like, and that's being done by the people who were harmed, as Ari mentioned. Those are the main people who need to be at the table, but we're not at the table alone. We're at the table with the people who perpetuated that harm.
Yes, I wrote down the 10-point action plan.
All 10 points, too.
I did, because, all these things, to me, seem reasonable. The first one, as you said, full formal apology. Number 2, repatriation. Indigenous Peoples Development Program. Cultural institutions. Public health crisis. Illiteracy eradication. African Knowledge Program, psychological rehabilitation, technology transfer, and as you mentioned, debt cancellation. My family is from Puerto Rico, so we are struggling right now with a very real debt that keeps growing, which again is imposed by colonizers.
Right.
Let me speak to the injury areas here in the United States. The very first one is our peoplehood was destroyed. We were snatched from under the covering of God and made property. Like, you buy and sell bushels of sweetened corn and wood, right? And second one is economics. We had no capacity of ownership. Third one is education. We was denied thoroughly in respect to education. And the fourth one is in terms of our health. And when you trace the medical science in the United States, you often see us there as the ones who have been experimented on, and all types of these vague notions of inferiority based on the size of your brain and all the other type of stuff. But the primary dealt with the color of your skin. So those are the key things that we want to focus on here in the United States now. Those are broad categories. But when you're on the other side of the table, you can negotiate what all the items that will come under that particular category. For us, the primary one is peoplehood, because it all starts with who you are. If that has been snatched from you, then you don't know who you are. And that's one of the greatest crimes against humanity that can be committed, when you snatch someone from their peoplehood and destroy their culture. And so that's where we want to go at first, right there, because then that empowers all those descendants who are currently here on this planet or in the United States, that they can feel better now, really understand what happened to them. They just didn't fall out the sky this way. They didn't come up from the earth this way. But it was made this way by the system of chattel enslavement. So we want to deconstruct that institution.
Right.
And the university normally holds it up.
So one might argue that the reason why they don't want to apologize or acknowledge and tell the truth about what happened is because they're still benefiting today from these systems of oppression. Right. What are some of the structures that are created that still keep people of color and the descendants of slaves, as subordinates or oppressed?
I think it can definitely be mapped onto those areas that Ari has mentioned, right? And so there's not a kind of a section of any assessment of well-being that you do for Black and Indigenous people in this hemisphere, whether it's around health, family wealth, education. There's no marker of well-being that you do where Black and Indigenous people are not falling behind kind of systematically across the board. And so that's why the segments that Ari mentioned, and even the scope of the Caribbean reparations plan, it speaks to all of these facets, right? Because slavery as an institution, genocide as an institution affected all of those, right? So when someone doesn't believe that you're a person, they don't care about your education, they don't care about your health, they don't care about whether or not you kind of accumulate wealth. They don't care about any of those things. And so all of those factors end up falling behind because structurally you weren't considered a person, right? Like those are parts of your personhood. And so if someone structurally doesn't care, then there's no incentive to help you in any way or to allow you to. So I'm from Jamaica, and so when the British left Jamaica, we had an illiteracy rate that was almost 90%, right? So imagine that. You have a country full of people who don't know how to read, and so how do you build national infrastructure? How do you get teachers? How do you create a government when people just don't have those basic skills? And so there's no institution, there's no kind of facet of society that hasn't been marked by the way in which slavery and genocide touched this part of the world, because that was what we did, right? Like that was the foundation of this hemisphere, was through kind of systematic colonization. So there's not one that I could think of, right? If you banks, schools, hospital, medical science, right? Like science was built on experimentation on Black and brown people, and so there isn't, and so that's why a lot of the work that people are doing, kind of, critical race theorists and people who are interested in shifting pedagogy, a lot of the work that they're doing is kind of unbuilding institutions, because these institutions were founded on the idea that who a person was didn't include Black and brown bodies, right? So it means psychologists now have to kind of redo a lot of the work, right? So the answer is all of them. All of the institutions in every possible way have been affected by this. And because many of them don't acknowledge that, it is very hard, right? Thinking about institutions like the university, and I go to a school that, very prestigious, like long history, and what work has Penn done in terms of making itself more accommodating or more inclusive of Black and brown people, right? Like they have departments set up for that, because the institution originally was not meant to include a lot of the students who are there now.
Yeah, and I fashioned a solution in terms of the University of Pennsylvania Law School to set up a legal clinic, a reparation legal clinic, to really begin to drill down on the issues, right? And to do it in such a way that it's targeted, and that the people, the descendants of the enslavers, likewise are participating with the descendants of the enslaved. That's who carry the burden of debt and inheritance right now. So why shouldn't we be able to be at the table and correct the problems of our forefathers, both as enslavers and the enslaved? And so that's what we're trying to do, is put ourselves back on that same human level as everybody else, and no longer look at us as a peculiar people, but humans just like everyone else. You see? So that's important. Secondly, mass incarceration. The new Jim Crow. And so the new Jim Crow basically talks about refining this element of enslavement, the Jim Crow area, right? And now it's new in this day. And so there's a new way they do incarceration, there's a new way that they do education, there's a new way they do economics. But we have to be able to look at it in such a way that makes sure that everybody's been affected, everybody's been involved, are at the table and solving the problem for America. There's a such thing called a reciprocal zero-sum end, which basically means everybody at the table benefits. Both sides of the table benefits. Now we should be developed enough to come up with some type of so-called reparations accord, as opposed to just a proclamation where none of the enslaved people really participated in it, right? It just dumped on us.
Because then it would just be symbolic and
right.
wouldn't mean anything.
So that's my fear. That the University of Pennsylvania is going to do more like the other universities have done, make up their own decision how they're going to deal with this whole thing called reparatory justice and reparations. And that's wrong. It's going to push everybody back hundreds of years, right? Because again, they're not releasing that superiority that their ancestors held up. At the White House now, one of the first things that our President Trump did was proclaim white nationalism. Come on. You see? And everybody, so therefore, they're going to find ways to refine that white nationalism, that white supremacy, right? They're going to try and find a way to refine it and sell it, rebuild it, and send it, give it back to us. Mostly going to go through the higher education institutions as well. The language in most of the readings on the subject, or readings generally about Africans enslaved in the United States, they call us slaves, but we're much more than slaves, right? And we were made slaves. We was humans. We was the scientists, the philosophers, you see? And they took all that away, you know, and made sure and infected laws that say that, no, you cannot read, you cannot vote, you cannot defend yourself in court, you cannot testify against a white person. All those types of things, those are human capital issues. And so all of our energies first must go towards those things to rebuild our sense of ourselves, and also give the descendants of the enslavers a way to come to grips with what their ancestors did. You know, both sides of the table now are here to correct the problem, to correct the damage, repair the damage. And that's what I like to see happen. And I hope that university students at UPENN will help walk through that door, you know? I mean, it's a difficult struggle, but I understand. But we can just talk it, begin to talk up on it, never knows what can happen.
Well, there's a famous saying in community media, which is, we begin by listening, right? And so that's what we try to do here on the People Power Lunch Hour. So before we wrap up, I really want to thank you for the work that you're doing, these conversations that you're having. How can people get more information and be a part of this work? And one of the resources that I recommend is this movie, The Price of Memory, which is a documentary about reparations and reparatory justice in Jamaica. Films like these really help inform people. I think not just institutions, but individuals of this country need to take responsibility, learn the truth, get away from this revisionist history, and then you'll begin to understand why people feel the way that they do. Yeah. Can you talk about some resources quickly before we go to a break?
So like I mentioned earlier, the symposium is online on the Penn Law website, and folks will get a chance to hear Ari and the other speakers talk about their work and talk about reparations, reparatory justice in general. There's also, we included in the program, and I think it is on the website, I'll have to check, but we included a reading list for people that includes scholarly articles, books, movies, things that really help to situate reparations in the larger history of movement building. So that's available. I also think it's really important that people just make space for these conversations, right? So we were students at a law school that had the opportunity to do something. And we said, okay, what do we want this space to be? And so we made space for people who have been working on reparations for decades to come and talk about their work. And in doing that, it legitimized the struggle. So I think people who have book clubs, if you have movie nights, if you're a teacher, if you have any space that you have control over, I think making room for reparations is a first step in terms of legitimizing the struggle, and also spreading the word so that people know that we are on our way, right? And so the more people that know what's happening, know our history, and kind of know what the next steps are, the better we'll be.
Ari, Shaunee, I want to thank you so much for joining us on the People Power Lunch Hour show.
Thank you.
We hope you'll come back again and continue this conversation. If you want to search online for more information, you can search University of Pennsylvania Law Symposium, Reparations Now. There's a lot of links and information, which we'll also put on our PhillyCam social media pages. I'm Vanessa Graber, the host, and we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk with the organizers of a new organization called Democratize Now. You are watching PhillyCam TV on Comcast and Verizon, and listening on WPPM 106.5 FM.